There was a time when Hollywood could freeze the world with a single photograph. No sound, no movement, just an image that burned itself into the minds of millions. And few pictures ever carried that kind of power like the one of Raquel Welch standing in that legendary fur bikini. It was daring, unforgettable, and it transformed her into an icon in a single moment. But what the world saw in that flash was only the surface. Behind the posters, behind the camera flashes, there was a woman fighting a completely different war. Hollywood had already decided who she was supposed to become. A symbol, a fantasy, a face that sold tickets. But Raquel Welch wanted something far more meaningful, something deeper, something authentic. And that hunger would place her in the middle of relationships that were anything but simple. Because in an industry built on power, image, and absolute control, the people who enter your life can determine your entire destiny. Some lift you higher, others quietly hold you down, and a select few leave scars that never truly heal. For Raquel, the men she encountered along the way were never just co-stars or partners. They were turning points. Each one representing a moment where she had to decide who she was going to become and how much she was willing to sacrifice for it. This is not simply a story about fame or beauty. This is a story about pressure, identity, and the painful cost of being completely misunderstood in a world that rarely offers second chances. And at the center of it all stand 5 men, each connected to a chapter of her life she could never fully walk away from. These are the 5 men Raquel Welch could never forget. Raquel Welch entered the world as Jo Raquel Tejada on September 5, 1940 in Chicago, Illinois, born into a family that already carried a mixture of cultures and competing expectations. Her father, an engineer from Bolivia, brought discipline and rigid structure into their home, while her American mother encouraged creativity and free expression. Soon after, the family relocated to California, where young Raquel would grow up surrounded by sunshine, ambition, and the quiet gravitational pull of the entertainment world. From an early age, she stood apart, not just because of her striking beauty, but because of her relentless determination. She studied ballet for years, dreaming of a career in performance, but physical limitations eventually forced her to abandon that dream. That early disappointment would forge her resilience. She turned instead to beauty pageants, winning several local titles, and later found work as a weather presenter and model. Each small step brought her closer to Hollywood, but nothing came easily, and absolutely nothing was handed to her. Her breakthrough arrived in 1966 with films like Fantastic Voyage and most famously 1 Million Years BC. It was the latter that changed absolutely everything. That single image of her in a fur bikini became one of the most iconic visuals of an entire decade. Overnight, Raquel Welch became a global sensation. But with that fame came a label that would stalk her for years. She was seen not as an actress but as a product. And that was the struggle that defined much of her career. Raquel was intelligent, disciplined, and deeply committed to her craft. Yet Hollywood continued to offer her roles that emphasized appearance over substance. She pushed back quietly but firmly, choosing projects carefully and refusing to be treated as disposable merchandise. It was never the easiest path, and it often placed her directly against powerful figures behind the scenes. Her personal life reflected that same search for control and meaning. She was married 4 times, each relationship revealing a different chapter of her life, each one shaped by both hope and heartbreak. Through it all, she maintained a sense of independence that set her apart from most of her contemporaries. Raquel Welch was never just the image the world remembered. She was a woman navigating an industry that constantly tried to define her, surrounded by people who influenced her path in ways both visible and invisible. And among them were 5 men whose presence left permanent marks on her life and career. Number 5, Patrick Curtis. Patrick Curtis was not simply the first husband of Raquel Welch. In many ways, he was the first man who truly recognized her potential in a world that had not yet noticed her existence. When they met in the late 1950s, Raquel was still Jo Raquel Tejada, a young woman trying to find her place, balancing small television jobs and modeling work while raising a family. Curtis entered her life at a moment when opportunity was uncertain and direction was not yet clear. At first, his presence felt like stability. He believed in her, encouraged her, and perhaps most importantly, helped guide her into the structure of the entertainment industry. Curtis became far more than a partner. He became her manager, shaping her early career decisions and helping her navigate the complicated doors of Hollywood. It was under his influence that Raquel began moving closer to the kind of exposure that would eventually change everything. But with that guidance came control. As Raquel's career began to explode, especially after her sudden rise to international fame in the mid-1960s, the dynamic between them started shifting dramatically. What had once felt like support slowly became something far more restrictive. Curtis had a clear vision of how Raquel should be presented to the world, and that vision leaned heavily into the very image she would later struggle to escape. The glamorous, carefully manufactured symbol, the woman defined by appearance rather than depth. For Raquel, this created a quiet but growing suffocation. She was grateful for the doors that had been opened, but she was no longer the same person who had needed someone else to guide every step. She wanted control over her choices, her roles, and her identity as an actress. And that desire could not coexist with someone who still held the reins so tightly. Their relationship, once built on shared ambition, began to shatter under the weight of that imbalance. The more her independence grew, the more inevitable the distance between them became. Eventually, the marriage ended, marking one of the first major turning points in her life. But Patrick Curtis was never just a chapter she could erase. He was the man who helped her step into Hollywood, the one who stood beside her before the world knew her name. And at the same time, he was the first person who showed her how easily support could transform into imprisonment. In many ways, he taught her the lesson that would follow her for the rest of her career. If she wanted to be more than an image, she would have to seize control of her own story. Number 4. Richard Zanuck. Richard D. Zanuck was not just another figure in Hollywood. He was raw power. As a leading executive at 20th Century Fox, Zanuck belonged to a generation of producers who did not simply make films. They shaped careers, controlled images, and decided who would rise and who would be quietly discarded. And for Raquel Welch, crossing paths with a man like him meant stepping directly into the heart of that system. By the mid-1960s, Raquel was no longer an unknown name. After Fantastic Voyage and the global impact of 1 million years BC, she had become one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Studios saw her as a bankable star, a guaranteed draw, and Zanuck understood exactly how to position her within that machine. On the surface, this was everything an actress could hope for. Big studio backing, major projects, and international exposure. But behind that success was a very different reality. Zanuck represented the kind of Hollywood that believed in control above everything else. Image was everything. And once an image worked, it was rarely changed. For Raquel, that meant being repeatedly placed into roles that emphasized her appearance rather than her ability. The industry had found its formula and it had zero interest in taking risks that might disrupt it. While audiences adored her, the opportunity she truly wanted, the roles with emotional depth and complexity, remained just out of reach. This created a quiet but persistent fury. Raquel was not someone who lacked awareness. She understood exactly how she was being marketed, and she also understood the cost of it. Every successful role that reinforced her image made it harder for directors and producers to see her any other way. And men like Zanuck, operating at the highest level of studio power, had no incentive to change a formula that was already printing money. There was no single explosive conflict, no dramatic confrontation that defined their relationship. Instead, it was something far more subtle and perhaps more damaging. A system that smiled, that rewarded, but also limited. A system that gave her visibility but never genuine respect. For Raquel Welch, Richard Zanuck became a symbol of that painful reality. The man who helped elevate her career while simultaneously keeping her within boundaries she had never chosen for herself. And it was in navigating that contradiction that she began to understand something essential about Hollywood. Sometimes the people who help you rise are the very ones who decide how far you are allowed to go. Number 3. Jim Brown. Jim Brown entered Raquel Welch's story at a moment when her image was already firmly established, but her identity as an actress was still being questioned. By the time they worked together on 100 Rifles in 1969, Raquel was known across the entire world. She was admired, talked about, and constantly watched. But she was also searching for something far more meaningful than the roles she had been given so far. Jim Brown brought with him a very different kind of presence. Before Hollywood, he had been one of the most dominant forces in professional football. A man defined by strength, confidence, and an unshakable sense of self. When he transitioned into acting, that same intensity followed him onto the screen. He was not easily overshadowed, and he did not adjust himself to fit expectations. In many ways, he represented a new kind of leading man, one who carried both physical authority and cultural significance. Their collaboration in 100 Rifles quickly became one of the most talked about moments of Raquel's entire career. Not just because of the film itself, but because of a scene that would spark widespread conversation. At a time when Hollywood was still terrified of crossing certain social boundaries, Raquel and Jim Brown appeared together in a moment that challenged expectations and drew intense public attention. It was bold, unexpected, and for millions of viewers, completely unforgettable. But behind that moment was enormous pressure. Raquel understood that every decision she made was being watched more closely than ever before. Working alongside Jim Brown meant stepping into a space where the usual rules did not apply. The reactions from the public were violently mixed. Some saw it as progress, others as pure controversy. And once again, Raquel found herself at the center of a narrative she did not completely control. Yet this experience marked a turning point. For the first time, she was no longer simply fitting into the image Hollywood had created for her. She was part of something that pushed boundaries, something that forced audiences to see her in a completely different light. It was not always comfortable, and it was not without risk, but it was real. Jim Brown was not a man who defined her, but he was someone who challenged the space around her. Through that collaboration, Raquel began to move, even if only slightly, beyond the limits that had been placed on her. And sometimes in Hollywood, even the smallest shift can change absolutely everything. Number 2, Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds was in many ways the embodiment of a completely different kind of Hollywood star. Charismatic, confident, and often completely unpredictable, he carried a presence that could dominate not just a single scene but an entire production. By the time he worked with Raquel Welch on Fuzz in 1972, Reynolds was already building a reputation as someone who did things his own way, regardless of expectations. For Raquel, this was a very different kind of dynamic than anything she had experienced before. On the surface, the pairing made perfect sense. Two recognizable stars, both with strong screen appeal, both capable of drawing massive audiences. But once filming began, it became clear that their approaches could not have been more different. Raquel was disciplined, precise, and deeply focused on maintaining control over her performance. She had spent years fighting to be taken seriously, and every single role mattered to her in that ongoing battle. Reynolds, on the other hand, thrived on pure spontaneity. He was known for improvising, for shifting the tone of scenes without warning, and for bringing an energy that did not always follow the script. For some productions, that unpredictability added charm. But for Raquel, it created constant tension. It disrupted the structure she relied on and at times pulled attention away from the balance she was trying to create on screen. There was no single moment where everything fell apart. Instead, the strain built gradually. Small differences in approach turned into larger disagreements about tone, focus, and control. Reynolds had a way of commanding attention without ever asking for it. And in an industry that often favored louder personalities, that presence could easily overshadow everyone else. But Raquel Welch was not someone who faded into the background. Rather than stepping back, she held her ground completely. She remained focused, continued to deliver her performance with precision, and refused to reshape herself simply to accommodate someone else's style. It was never the easiest path and it did not always create harmony, but it revealed something essential about who she truly was. This was not just a clash of personalities. It was a reflection of a larger reality within Hollywood at that time, a space where strong male figures were often given complete freedom while women were expected to constantly adapt. In Burt Reynolds, Raquel encountered not just a co-star, but a test. A moment where she had to decide whether to yield or to stand firm. And she chose to stand absolutely firm. Number 1, Robert Evans. Robert Evans was not an actor, not a co-star, and not someone audiences would immediately connect to a single performance. But in Hollywood, men like him often held far more power than the faces on the screen. As a legendary producer and former head of production at Paramount Pictures, Evans stood at the very top of an industry built on influence, timing, and decisions made behind closed doors. And for Raquel Welch, that kind of power would prove to be both an opportunity and a quiet obstacle. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Evans was shaping some of the most important projects in Hollywood. He had an instinct for what audiences wanted. And more importantly, he had the authority to decide who would be part of those stories. For any actor or actress, being in his circle could mean the difference between a career that soared and one that slowly drifted into oblivion. Raquel understood this completely. She had already experienced what it meant to be elevated by the system and limited by it at the same time. But with Evans, the stakes felt different. This was not just about roles or image. This was about access, about being included in the conversations that determined the future of Hollywood itself. And yet that access was never guaranteed. There were moments when opportunities seemed close, when the possibility of more substantial roles appeared within reach. But just as often, those opportunities shifted, changed direction, or vanished entirely. Decisions were made quietly without explanation, and the reasons behind them were rarely visible. This was the side of Hollywood that few people outside the industry ever truly understood. For Raquel, it became painfully clear that talent and determination were not always enough. There were forces at play that operated beyond performance, beyond public image, and beyond anything she could fully control. Robert Evans came to represent that crushing realization. He was not a villain, nor was he a savior. He was something far more complex, a symbol of how the industry truly worked. A reminder that even the most recognizable stars were still navigating a system where power was concentrated in the hands of a very few individuals. And in facing that reality, Raquel Welch reached a turning point. She no longer waited for Hollywood to define her path. She began making choices on her own terms, even when those choices meant walking away from opportunities that did not align with who she wanted to become. Because in the end, the most important role she would ever take on was not one written by a producer. It was the one she created entirely for herself. Looking back now, the story of Raquel Welch is not simply about fame, beauty, or even success. It is about pure endurance. It is about navigating a world that constantly tried to define her before she had the chance to define herself. And perhaps most of all, it is about the people she encountered along the way. The ones who shaped her journey in ways both visible and invisible. Each of the 5 men in her life represented something completely different. Patrick Curtis was the beginning. The man who opened the first door, but also showed her how easily guidance could become control. Richard Zanuck stood for the system itself, a powerful force that could elevate a star while quietly strangling their growth. Jim Brown marked a moment of change, a step into unfamiliar territory, where expectations were challenged and boundaries were violently pushed. Burt Reynolds became a test of strength, a reminder that standing your ground was never easy, but always necessary. And Robert Evans in the end revealed the deeper truth about Hollywood. That power often exists beyond talent, beyond effort, and beyond any sense of fairness. But what makes Raquel's story truly lasting is not what these men did or what they represented. It is how she responded. She never fully allowed herself to be destroyed by the roles she was given or by the expectations placed upon her. Even when the industry tried to trap her in a single image, she continued to push, to adapt, and to protect her identity. That quiet, fierce determination became her legacy. Today, when people remember Raquel Welch, they often recall the image that made her famous. But those who look closer see something far more enduring. A woman who understood the cost of being seen and who chose again and again to be more than what the world expected. And in the end, that may be the reason her story still resonates today, because it was never just about who she was on screen. It was about who she chose to become when the cameras finally stopped watching.